In 2002, 2003, I spent a year rewriting a global banking constitution using correct communication, parsing, syntax, grammar, and quantum grammar mechanics on every single sentence. So the sentences could be written frontwards and backwards and still maintain the same volition of what the meaning of the sentence was trying to articulate. I rewrote the bank charters for the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the shipping mechanics to be placed within those constructs to move foreign commerce. I really didn't get into the quantum stock market securities collections for global postal service mechanics. You may see that on the board up there, and what that deals with is it deals with a concept of taking the titles and taking the values that we have created within the citizens that come forward either for posits in the bank. And I say the word posits, not deposits, because the prefix DE means to separate from. So if you go to a bank and you do a deposit, you're separating yourself from your posit or your position. The bank then turns around and hands you a receipt. RE means no, seat is contract, so they give you no contract back. Therefore, you've just separated yourself from your equity or your position. So in our banking system, either in our global-monetary-fund or our world-central-banking system, depending on what, if we're dealing with a corporation, if we're dealing with private citizens, we do posits. The global, the stock markets that we have, as I've gave publications to every stock market in the world back in 2007. Yes, 2008, I apologize, 2008, January of 2008. And the stock markets around the world kept my quantum stock market that I presented them. The quantum stock market had specific mechanics in it for the placement of values on commodities, on cargoes, on titles. It had correct communication, parsing, syntax, grammar to give a building block for foundations for stock markets. Like I said, I sent it to all stock markets, but instead of accepting some of my registered correspondence, the stock markets became wise to what I was doing. Instead of refusing it, flipped the documents over, placing a registration stamp on the back of the mailing, and mailed it back to me, which was in the fiction world, they call that a sealed letter of credit, sealed being a past tense pronoun, of is an adverb, letter is a verb, of is an adverb making credit a verb. So it's a condition of state that doesn't exist. We have contracts of the value. So as they came back under a consignment consignee for NALM, NALM is the passenger that boards the vessel, such as the green cards that you see in front of the claimant there. The name on the vessel may have been the Vasilis. It may have been the claimant itself, mailing it registration to himself. When they came back to my post office where I was staying at the time, the post office says, we got a document here, but we don't know what it is. And they came from 5 different various stock markets, International Court of Arbitration, through the International Chamber of Commerce out of Singapore, Malaysia, Johannesburg, South Africa, Australia, Brazil, Colombia, and a couple other stock markets. I just don't have the paperwork with me, and I apologize because I didn't know I was going to be giving this presentation when I got here. But instead of refusing the documents, they put the registration like I was saying. And so what I did is I placed my autograph across the registered identification from those specific postal systems from the countries that mailed them back to me. And I met with the post office, the postmaster of that specific post office, a postal employee, the senior postal employee for the shift, as well as 2 postal inspectors. And when I placed my autograph across the stamp, saying that this is a contract of the value, a sealed contract of the value, not credit, because this was an actual condition of state of building block. Credit is something that is in the future, so we had a contract. When I placed my autograph across the mail registration, both front and back, the United States Post Office then put their bullet stamp and round 8 seal over my registration from frontwards and backwards. I also then put my autograph across the bullet stamp from those specific countries' postal systems, which made me postmaster, banker of that vessel contract. I then sat down with the founders of the International Monetary Fund families, and I explained to them what I had done. They told me in all functions of postal movements for the bills of the ladings that I was correct. So I'm not guessing at this. This is not a guess. This is actual correctness to create a foundation to take the titles, to take the lawsuits, and put them into our own postal functioning for collections. Now, when you look at the collections, and David did a great explanation earlier about how the Universal Postal Union was trumped because they had full closure under Title 42, 1986, and they were given rescission, and they did not stop and correct, which means they were still modifying they couldn't humble themselves to come to us. Number one probably was 95% because of their uneducation and their second grade reading and writing level. So because they would not humble themselves and come to us for correction, the U.S. Postal Service autographed the stamps for the bills of the ladings and then was able to command a duty, which was to collect of the fiction people that had taken their monies offshore. But when we use the postal mechanics of this, as a claimant comes in or a banker would come in, right? Because a banker is going to okay, so you got title. How do we collateralize this? How do we collect on this? I don't comprehend the mechanics of it. David has placed his autograph across those stamps on those contracts. He has seen those contracts. I have placed them. If a banking system chooses to come in and join with the quiet title for monetization to place liens against it to create monies for their contracts, either through a marshalling hyphen lien or a marshalling hyphen security, it just depends on the bailment that they choose to use. The bank would then come under an amnesty clause that David and I would draft up to allow them to join in the commercialization of that vessel, because they would be joining our function, because we can place our own value on what the values are on the title, because we have a correct survey. We can place the value on our arbitration of it, because on a separate issue from that, I also alerted the International Bank of Settlements, being an adjective pronoun, the being an adverb, international being an adjective, bank being a pronoun, of is an adverb modifying banks backwards, and the verb in front of it, settlements, as well as the International Court of Arbitration. So we could take it in either out of in the personam or in the rem, just depending on the banker's knowledge and how they want to interact with that. So that's kind of where we're at with that for right now. And at the end of writing that, I went and served the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, D.C. In the meetings, I placed the bank charter out on the table, as well as the gold and silver, a sack for the fee for freight for that constitution, banking constitution. Once the attorneys read the charter, the first 2 pages, they started physically shaking, telling me, "Do you know what this means?" I said, "Yes." And I walked up around the table, around, and reached in between them, and I grabbed the gold and silver, and I said, "And now I'm paying myself to be this person." And what it did was it set up the ship's channels for that constitution to function where other countries and nations could join with it. I then immediately went down to the United Nations with David Wincol Miller. And we spent 4 months cold calling, meeting, being called into meetings with 82 nations at the United Nations, presenting them the banking constitution. It was very wonderful because the diplomats were very kind. There was not a lot of animosity there. They had a lot of questions.
a lot of times we would drop the bank charters off, leave them our phone number, they'd call us back, and we'd go in and they'd ask us questions about the contract, about what it meant, especially because they were intrigued that it could go in and out of all languages in the world and lose no deviation in its sentence structure. So they saw great value to that. So what they did is when we went in and met with these ambassadors, 82 of them, each one of them said that they had given the Constitution, Global Banking Constitution, to their country's treasury, and that the treasury would be studying the styles of syntax and the styles of mechanics to move values within their own constructs. Met a lot of wonderful people. Like I said, they were extremely kind to us. There was no animosity. Some consular posts ran a little different mechanics as far as in China, for instance. The Chinese embassy, they posted up guards around their flag with machine guns. So and they didn't fly yellow fringe on their flag. Everywhere else flew yellow fringe on their flags. And now, when you walk into all embassies at the United Nations in New York, they're flying a ball on top of the flag standard on a 3x5 boat flags of that country to walk into the foreign vessel and dry dock. This is correct. However, when you go into the embassy themselves, they're flying spires on top of the flag standards, denoting their at war with their people. And we actually got about 30 to 35 ambassadors admitting that the United Nations was set up to engage in war against the people. Because of the flag standards, they couldn't get around the protocols of what they were advertising. So we called them on it. And they were, yes, this is correct, you are correct. At the end of that 4 months, I met with I was down at the post office at the UN Plaza there where all the flags hang. And I dropped off my banking charter there because I wanted them to have closure at the post office at the United Nations of who I am. And as soon as I identified myself, they said, "Can you please wait a second?" And they called up to the head office there at the United Nations. And they said, "Mr. Gould, someone would like to talk to you." I said, "Okay." And they handed me the phone. And it was the Postmaster Director, which is equivalent to the Postmaster General of the United Nations. He said, "Hey, we're coming to get you. Just stand put, stand put." It says, "People are coming over, and they're going to move you across the street." So they came in, they sequestered me, the UN people. They were UN, some of them were UN troops, some were just people in suits. And they took me and David across the street. Well, when we got across the street, we sat down, the head of the Postal Administration, Robert Gray, came to speak with me. I asked him a couple technical questions about the mechanics of his postal functions there. And he said, "Russell," he says, "you are the Postmaster General of the world." He says, "I do not have enough knowledge to answer your questions. At the United Nations, we use adverbs, verbs, adjectives, and pronouns. We have no facts here. We're a non-factor in the factual world." I says, "That is correct." He says, "However, we would like to be your student, for you're the greatest postmaster walking planet Earth." I said, "Okay, that's cool." And he had his paparazzi, which means people with cameras, and they all lined up, and he shook my hand, and I handed him the bank charter, and he was shaking my hand, and they were taking our pictures. It was pretty interesting. You know, that was my first time really in the public sector on a global level, to where I was seeing that I was making a difference, because they were very receptive to the concept of a math interface on grammar, where you could go in and out of all languages in the world, because they were a corporate umbrella system set up for contracting languages from all different walks around the world. And so they liked the fact that the math that we were using could go in and out of all languages in the world and lose no deviation in its sentence structure. They found great value to that. So that was my, at that point I left the United Nations, and I have not been back. Yeah, when he confessed he didn't have knowledge, the postal administrator, that they had no authorization to exist, to move troops, to move anything. It was just a ruse on the ignorance of the people who actually were buying into it. Yeah, they had no authorization to exist as a corporation because their charters were in past tense and future tense, which gave it no now space authorization. So that was, to get him to admit to that was pretty cool. And for him to be so kind and, you know, and not be antagonistic towards me, I found very, very, very humbling, and I was very kind back. So that was my story at the United Nations, and it took 4 months to do that. Now I'd like to speak with the U.S. military about my position as Muster-Master, Master-General, Commander-in-Chief, and Comptroller of the Global Currency, as well as Postmaster General of the world, in correlation with the International Criminal Court of Justice at The Hague. The international, before you go into the military and your specific branches of the military, you physically go in and register, pre-register, and get your registration number from your country's post office. You take that registration number, and then upon receiving that, then you can go into your specific branch of the military. Well, why is that? Because you're in the middle of fighting postal wars, and there's postal settlements that people may choose to make a claim on you later on in life for accountability. During my court-martialing of George Walker Colin Bush and the 5,000 admirals and generals at the Pentagon, I ended up with a chance to file a publication at the World Court at The Hague. When I did that, the head clerk of court wrote me a letter specifically. I syntexed her letter, proving it 100% fraud, autographed the postage stamp filed at the World Court at The Hague, and had someone physically go over to The Hague and file in my position as Commander-in-Chief with The Hague and get it back filed with me. And what that did was it disqualified the judges, because the clerk is the judge. The judges are just actors giving you opinions. Their gavel makes clangs. Clang, clang, clang. The clerk's gavel, being the postage stamp, leaves marks. That file stamp is classified as a bill of the lading to transport vessel contracts with the people of cargo aboard the vessel contracts to bring you in and out of that foreign vessel. However, the clerk of that court at The Hague is bound to performance to the Universal Postal Union in Bern, Switzerland, as a clearinghouse mechanic, which I've disqualified their function at the Universal Postal Union, because I'm Postmaster General of that location. I'm also Postmaster General of the location at the Pentagon. So in order for them to sue Special Forces, Black Ops, hold anybody accountable, they have to meet the grammar standards of the correctness that they all have knowledge of, that I gave importing and closure on back in 2004 at the World Court at The Hague. So if there are soldiers out there that are currently, or where people are trying to come after them for some form of crime, military crime, please contact me. I am the #1 guy for you to hire for services, so I can tow you through their beacons and get the case charges dropped from you or your colleagues. Because all of their clearances are null and void at the World Court at The Hague for the statement of a claim against you, because they're in usury of a fiction with no authorization. The soldiers that are bound to keep secret clearances, because the clearance itself is written in adverb, it says nothing. So you are bound performance because you are caught up in usury with the post office. I have techniques, if you need out of those contracts, to show you how to navigate yourself so the military branches can't prosecute you for publication on your facts. So you can, I don't want to give those out on the public documentary here, but if there are tricks and there are secrets that I know that you would come under contract with me to tow you through clearing the slate for you so that you could come forward with your technology or your knowledge, if it's in the benefit of the safeguard of the public safety here and national security. Okay, so the World Court at The Hague, back to that. The clerk of courts has to, when someone makes a claim against a soldier, they have to come through the State Department and the respective military branches to give closure that there's an action pending. But in order to do that, they're going to have to put a file stamp on that contract so that they can tell you that they're trying to state a claim against you. I have done away with their capacity to do that against the citizens or the employees in the Pentagon. If they board my system and they pay fee for towage for services, I can show them how to direct their correspondence back through a channel that the World Court at The Hague will not be able to state a claim, nor the judges against the soldiers there. So if you have any questions, please contact me.